I never meant to fall in love with a man who looked at me as though I were invisible. But love, I have learned, cares nothing for intention. What began as survival became my salvation, though the path between those two shores was paved with shame, secrecy, and a single drawing on a linen napkin that changed everything. My name is Vivian Ashford, and before I became a maid at Thornwood Hall, I was the daughter of Sir Edmund Ashford, a man whose brilliance with numbers was matched only by his recklessness with fortune. My mother died when I was young, a fever taking her in the dead of winter when the frost clung to the windows like lace and the world seemed made entirely of silence. I remember standing at her bedside, too young to understand death but old enough to recognize its permanence in the way my father's shoulders shook as he wept. After my mother's passing, I became my father's constant companion. He raised me among ledgers and architectural drawings, tutored me in mathematics and engineering by candlelight in his cluttered study, his voice patient as he explained the elegant logic of load-bearing structures and the poetry of geometric proofs. He believed that a sharp mind knew no gender, that knowledge was a gift too precious to be denied based on the accident of one's sex. He was ahead of his time in that regard, though tragically behind it in matters of prudence. I grew up in Ashford Park, a modest but comfortable estate in Hampshire, surrounded by rolling green hills and ancient oak trees. Our house was filled with books and instruments, with half-finished inventions and models of buildings that existed only in my father's imagination. I learned to read architectural plans before I learned to embroider, to calculate stress loads before I learned to pour tea properly. It was an unconventional education for a young lady of gentle birth, and I knew even then that it set me apart from other girls my age. But I did not mind. I loved the certainty of numbers, the way they revealed truths that words could obscure. I loved the challenge of a difficult problem, the satisfaction of finding an elegant solution. And I loved my father, who looked at me not as a daughter to be married off, but as a mind to be cultivated. I remember the day everything changed with the clarity of a church bell on a winter morning. I was 23 years old, sitting in my father's study on a Thursday afternoon in November. Rain streaked the windows and the fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with books and papers. I was reviewing the accounts as I did every month, a task my father had delegated to me years earlier when he realized my facility with numbers exceeded his own. At first, I noticed only small discrepancies, a payment here that did not match the ledger, a deposit there that seemed to have vanished. But as I dug deeper, following the trail of numbers with growing dread, the full picture emerged. The investments my father had made in railway speculation, against my advice. The promissory notes he had signed to cover his losses, each one larger than the last. The debts that had accumulated like snow upon a roof until the whole structure threatened to collapse under their weight. I confronted him that evening, after dinner, in the same study where I had made my discovery. He sat in his favorite chair, a glass of port in his hand, and as I laid out what I had found, I watched the color drain from his face. He aged a decade in those few minutes, the lines around his eyes deepening, his shoulders curling forward as though bearing an invisible burden. "My dear girl," he whispered when I had finished, "I never meant for you to know." "How much?" I asked, my voice steadier than my heart. "How much do we owe?" he told me. The number was so large it seemed almost abstract, a figure from a nightmare rather than reality. Everything we owned, everything we had built, would not be enough to cover it. We lost the house within 6 months. The creditors came with their papers and their cold efficiency, inventorying our possessions, estimating the value of furniture that had belonged to my grandmother, paintings that had hung on our walls since before I was born. I watched them carry away my mother's jewelry, piece by piece, including the pearl earrings she had worn on her wedding day. My father, unable to bear the weight of his failure, succumbed to a fever that winter, though I have always believed it was shame that truly claimed him. The physicians spoke of inflammation of the lungs, of the cold and damp of the season, but I knew better. I had seen the way he looked at me in those final weeks, his eyes clouded with guilt and grief. He died holding my hand in a rented room above a shop in the village, whispering apologies that I tried to silence with forgiveness, though forgiveness came harder than I wished. I buried him in the churchyard beside my mother, in a plot paid for by the kindness of the vicar who remembered happier times. The funeral was sparsely attended. Most of our former friends had found reasons to be elsewhere, unwilling to be associated with scandal and disgrace. I stood alone at the graveside, the wind cutting through my black mourning dress, and wondered what would become of me. I was alone, a woman of gentle birth with no fortune, no husband, and no prospects. Society, that great and merciless arbiter of fate, had no place for me. The friends who had once danced with me at balls and taken tea in my drawing room now crossed the street to avoid meeting my eye. The young men who had courted me, who had praised my wit and admired my appearance, had vanished like morning mist. I was, in the eyes of the world, ruined. I could have become a governess, I suppose. I had the education for it, certainly more than most. But the thought of teaching needlework and French to girls who would grow into the very women who whispered about my family's disgrace was more than my pride could bear. I imagined sitting in some fine drawing room, invisible and ignored, listening to my employers discuss the unfortunate Ashford business as though I were not there. The humiliation would have been unbearable. So I did something that shocked even myself. I packed what little I owned into a single trunk, traveled north by coach for 3 long days, and applied for a position as a housemaid at Thornwood Hall, an estate so distant from my former life that I believed no one would recognize me. I gave my name as Vivian Gray, daughter of a respectable but poor family from the north. The housekeeper who interviewed me, a stern woman named Mrs. Harrow, looked at my hands, still too soft from years of gentle living, and asked if I had ever scrubbed a floor. I have done many things in my life, I replied, and I am willing to learn to do many more. Something in my answer must have satisfied her, for she hired me on the spot. I was given a uniform, a bed in the servants' quarters beneath the eaves, and a list of duties that began before dawn and ended after dark. That first night, lying on my narrow mattress, listening to the wind howl across the moors, I wept. I wept for my father, for my mother, for the life I had lost, and then I dried my tears and resolved to survive. Thornwood Hall was everything the rumors claimed and more. A magnificent estate of grey stone and countless windows, it rose from the Yorkshire moors like a monument to power and permanence. The house itself was ancient, parts of it dating back to the time of Elizabeth, with additions from every century since. Its towers and turrets stood against the sky like sentinels, and its countless chimneys spoke of fireplaces in every room, warmth against the bitter northern winters. The grounds stretched for miles, encompassing forests of oak and beech, farmland worked by tenant families for generations, gardens that had once been famous throughout the county, and greenhouses filled with exotic plants from distant lands. There was a lake to the south, dark and still, where swans glided in elegant pairs. There was a chapel to the west, its stained glass windows casting colored light on worn stone floors. And at the eastern edge of the property, cutting through a deep and treacherous ravine, was the River Thorn, wild and unforgiving. It was the river that had brought the current Duke his obsession. Sebastian Blackwood, the 7th Duke of Thornwood, was building a bridge. I learned about the bridge within my first week of service, for it was all anyone in the household discussed. The kitchen maids whispered about it over their washing. The footmen debated its progress in the servants' hall. Even Mrs. Harrow, usually so strict about gossip, would occasionally let slip some detail about the latest engineer to be dismissed in disgrace. The story, as I pieced it together from overheard conversations and careful questions, was this. The Duke's younger brother, Lord William Blackwood, had been an engineer of remarkable talent. Unlike his elder brother, bound by duty to manage the estate and prepare for the title, William had been free to pursue his passions. He had studied at Cambridge and then in Paris, learning from the greatest minds of the age. He had returned to England full of ideas and ambition, determined to leave his mark on the world. His dream had been the bridge. The ravine where the river Thorn ran was deep and dangerous, a natural barrier that had divided the estate for centuries. The only way to cross it was a winding path that descended to the river and climbed back up the other side, a journey of several hours that made managing the eastern portion of the estate difficult and expensive. William had conceived of a bridge that would span the entire ravine, connecting the two halves of the property and opening a direct route to the village of Thornwick beyond. It would transform the region, he had claimed in his letters and drawings, copies of which I would later see. It would bring prosperity to the tenants, who could reach markets more easily. It would bring trade to the village, which had languished in isolation. And it would bring glory to the family name, a monument to Blackwood ingenuity that would stand for centuries. But Lord William had died 3 years before my arrival, thrown from his horse during a storm on a night when the wind shrieked across the moors like a living thing. According to the servants, the Duke had found him at dawn, lying broken at the bottom of the ravine he had dreamed of conquering. The horse had survived. William had not. His death had devastated the Duke, who had worshipped his younger brother with the fierce protectiveness of a man who had lost their parents young. Their mother had died in childbirth. Their father had followed when Sebastian was barely 20, leaving him to raise William as much as to rule the estate. The bond between them had been deeper than brotherhood, and its severing had carved something out of Sebastian Blackwood that could never be replaced. According to the servants, the Duke had vowed to complete the bridge as a memorial to Lord William's genius. He had taken his brother's designs, incomplete though they were, and had sworn to make them reality. For 3 years, he had poured money and effort into the project, hiring engineers from London and Paris, importing materials from across the country, driving himself and his household with a determination that bordered on obsession. The problem, as I would soon discover, was that genius could not be inherited, and the engineers the Duke had hired to finish the project were proving woefully inadequate. My duties at Thornwood Hall were simple enough. I cleaned the upper corridors, sweeping carpets and polishing banisters until my arms ached. I changed the linens in the guest chambers, stripping beds of their fine sheets and making them fresh again with military precision. I dusted the endless ornaments that decorated every surface, the porcelain figures and silver candlesticks and framed miniatures of Blackwood's long dead. And occasionally, when the regular footmen were occupied elsewhere, I served at table. It was during these serving duties that I first encountered the Duke, though encountered is perhaps too strong a word for the way his gaze passed over me as though I were merely another piece of furniture. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his temples, and eyes the color of winter storms. His features were aristocratic, almost severe, with a strong jaw and a mouth that seemed perpetually set in a line of displeasure. There were shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, and a tension in his bearing that never quite relaxed, even when he sat in his own dining room surrounded by his own servants. He was handsome, I admitted to myself in the privacy of my small attic room, lying awake as the wind rattled the window panes. But his handsomeness was cold, like a marble statue one might admire but never wish to touch. He moved through his household like a ghost, present but not engaged, going through the motions of living without seeming to find any joy in it. In those first months, I watched him from the shadows of doorways and the corners of rooms, as servants do. We learn to be invisible, to see without being seen, to know the moods of our masters before they themselves are aware of them. I observed his habits, which were precise and unvarying. He rose at 6 and took his breakfast in his study, alone. He spent his mornings reviewing correspondence and estate business. His afternoons were devoted to the bridge, either visiting the construction site or meeting with engineers. His evenings were quiet, dinner taken in the great dining room if there were guests, in his study if there were not. I observed his moods, which ranged from distant to irritable to, on rare occasions, something approaching warmth when he spoke with his elderly aunt, Lady Beatrice, who served as the household's chatelaine. Lady Beatrice was a slight woman in her 70s, with silver hair and gentle eyes, and a way of speaking that could calm the most troubled waters. She had come to Thornwood Hall after Lord William's death, summoned by the Duke himself, who had recognized that he needed someone to manage the household he could not bring himself to care about. I learned that the Duke spent hours in his study poring over architectural drawings, sometimes late into the night when the rest of the house was asleep. I knew this because I was sometimes assigned to bring fresh candles or coal for the fire, and I would see him there, bent over his brother's plans, his brow furrowed, his fingers tracing lines he could not quite understand. There was something painful about watching him, this powerful man trying so desperately to comprehend something that remained beyond his grasp. And I learned that he had dismissed 3 chief engineers in the past year alone for what he deemed incompetence. The current one, a man named Fletcher who had been brought in from Manchester with glowing recommendations, was rumored to be on thin ice as well. The bridge, I gathered from overheard conversations, was failing. The foundation on the eastern bank was unstable, shifting with the seasons in ways the engineers could not predict. The arch they had attempted to construct had begun to show cracks before it was even completed, hairline fractures that spread like veins through the stone. The Duke had invested a fortune in the project, and he was no closer to completion than he had been the day his brother died. I should not have cared. It was not my concern, not my place. I was a housemaid, nothing more, and the affairs of dukes and engineers were as far above me as the stars. But my father had raised me to understand structures, to see mathematics as poetry and engineering as art. At night, in my narrow bed beneath the eaves, listening to the house settle around me, I found myself thinking about the bridge, imagining its curves and supports, wondering what errors the engineers had made. It was foolish. It was dangerous. But the mind, I have learned, cannot be easily silenced. The dinner party that changed my life occurred in late autumn, when the leaves had turned to gold and crimson, and the air carried the first bite of approaching winter. The moors had taken on their bleak beauty, vast expanses of brown and purple heather stretching to the horizon under skies that threatened rain. The River Thorn ran high with recent storms, its roar audible even from the house when the wind blew from the east. The Duke had invited a delegation of engineers from London, men of supposed reputation who had agreed to assess the bridge project and propose solutions. Mr. Fletcher, the current chief engineer, had reportedly begged for this consultation, desperate to shift blame for the project's failures onto others before the Duke's patience ran out entirely. The household had been in an uproar for days preparing for the visit. Every surface was polished until it gleamed. The silver was brought out of storage and buffed to mirror brightness. The cook prepared menus of elaborate complexity, course after course designed to impress and satisfy. The gardeners cut the last of the autumn flowers for arrangements that filled the public rooms with color and fragrance. Mrs. Harrow drove us servants with relentless efficiency, inspecting our work with an eye that missed nothing. The Duke rarely entertained, and his standards, when he did, were exacting. I was assigned to serve at the table that evening, a task I approached with the careful invisibility that had become my armor. I dressed in my cleanest uniform, a black dress with a white apron and cap, everything pressed and spotless. I pinned my hair beneath my cap so tightly it pulled at my scalp. And I took my place among the other servants along the wall of the great dining room, becoming part of the furniture, part of the shadows. The dining room at Thornwood Hall was magnificent. Paneled in dark oak, it stretched the length of the house's east wing, with tall windows that looked out over the gardens and, beyond them, the darkening moors. A great fireplace dominated one end, its mantel carved with the Blackwood family crest, a raven clutching an oak branch. Above it hung a portrait of the previous Duke, Sebastian's father, a stern man in formal dress who seemed to watch the proceedings with cold disapproval. Chandeliers of crystal hung from the ceiling, their candles casting a warm, flickering light that made the silver gleam and the crystal sparkle. The dinner began with the expected pleasantries. The engineers, 5 men of varying ages and degrees of pomposity, praised the estate and flattered the Duke, who received their compliments with the enthusiasm of a man receiving a bill. They spoke of the magnificence of the house, the beauty of the grounds, the honor of being invited to consult on such an important project. Their words were smooth and practiced, the currency of men who made their living by pleasing wealthy patrons. Lady Beatrice, seated at the Duke's right hand, made gracious conversation, her gentle voice smoothing over the awkward silences that fell whenever the Duke's responses grew too curt. She asked about their journeys from London, about their families, about the weather they had encountered on the road. She was skilled at this, I realized, at filling the empty spaces that Sebastian left, at making guests feel welcome when their host clearly wished they were elsewhere. The meal progressed through its courses: turtle soup, rich and fragrant with spices from distant lands; fish in a delicate butter sauce, garnished with herbs from the estate's gardens; roasted pheasant with vegetables prepared in the French style. Each dish was presented with ceremony, served with precision, and eaten with the careful manners that marked society dinners as performances rather than nourishment. It was during the fish course that the conversation turned to the bridge. The chief engineer from the London delegation, a portly man named Mr. Harrington with impressive whiskers and even more impressive confidence, set down his fork and cleared his throat with authority. He had been waiting for this moment, I realized, rehearsing what he would say. The meal had been merely prelude. The soil composition, he declared, gesturing with his hand as though lecturing students, was more variable than originally anticipated. The limestone bedrock was fractured in ways that made a traditional arch bridge inadvisable. The design Lord William had left behind, while innovative, was fundamentally flawed for the conditions present at the site. I watched the Duke's face as Mr. Harrington spoke, watched the way his jaw tightened and his eyes grew cold. His hand, resting on the table beside his wine glass, slowly curled into a fist. He said nothing, but I could feel the anger radiating from him like heat from a forge. To criticize the bridge was to criticize his brother's memory, and that, I understood, was something he would never permit. The other engineers offered their opinions, each more discouraging than the last. One, a thin man with spectacles who had been introduced as Dr. Pemberton, suggested abandoning the arch design entirely in favor of a suspension bridge, an idea the Duke rejected immediately as impractical for the location. "The ravine is too wide," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "and the winds through it would destroy any suspension system within a decade." Another proposed reinforcing the foundation with iron pilings driven deep into the bedrock, a solution that would have tripled the cost and taken years to implement. Mr. Fletcher, the current chief engineer, sat at the far end of the table, his face pale, contributing little to the discussion except nervous agreement with whatever the London experts said. Throughout the discussion, I moved silently around the table, refilling wine glasses and removing dishes, but my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about what they had said, about fractured limestone and variable soil, about the weight distribution of an arch and the forces that acted upon it. And slowly, like dawn breaking over the moors, an idea began to form. It was absurd. I knew it was absurd. I was a housemaid with no formal credentials, no authority to speak on such matters, no place at the table of educated men who had spent their lives studying the very problems I presumed to solve. And yet, as I listened to these gentlemen propose solution after inadequate solution, I could not help but think that they were missing something fundamental. They were treating the geology as an enemy to be conquered, rather than a partner to be embraced. The problem, as I saw it, was not the arch itself, but the way they were trying to distribute the load. A traditional semicircular arch would indeed be vulnerable to the fractured bedrock, for it would concentrate too much weight at the base supports. The limestone, already weakened by natural fault lines, would crack further under the pressure. But what if the arch were redesigned? What if, instead of fighting against the geology, they worked with it? I thought of my father's teachings, of the long evenings we had spent together in his study, poring over drawings of ancient structures. I thought of the elegant mathematics of load distribution, how weight could be transferred through curves and angles like water flowing downhill. I thought of the Gothic cathedrals whose flying buttresses had seemed like magic to me as a girl, their soaring spires defying gravity through genius application of force and counterforce. A series of smaller arches, I realized, each one transferring weight to the next, could spread the load across a wider area of the foundation. Instead of two massive supports bearing all the burden, a dozen smaller ones could share it, each resting on a different portion of the bedrock, so that even if one section shifted slightly, the others would compensate. Combined with counterweights at strategic points along the span, it could create a structure that was both stable and beautiful. The idea consumed me so completely that I barely noticed when the dinner ended, and the gentlemen retired to the drawing room for brandy and cigars. I moved through my duties in a daze, clearing the table and helping to wash the dishes in the great stone sinks of the kitchen, my hands working mechanically while my thoughts still turned over calculations and angles. The other servants spoke around me, their voices distant and meaningless, as I worked through the mathematics in my mind. It was later, much later, when the servants had mostly retired and I had been assigned to tidy the dining room one final time, that I committed my fatal error. The room was empty, lit only by the dying embers in the fireplace and a few candles that guttered in their holders. Shadows gathered in the corners, and the portrait of the old Duke seemed to watch me with particular intensity. On the table, someone had left a pencil beside the evening's menu. It lay there, innocent and ordinary, and yet it called to me like a siren's song. I do not know what possessed me. Perhaps it was the frustration of knowing an answer that no one would ever ask me to provide. Perhaps it was simply that the idea had grown too large to contain within my mind, pressing against the inside of my skull until I thought I might go mad with it. I picked up a linen napkin, fine white linen embroidered with the Blackwood crest in one corner. I took the pencil, and I began to draw. It was rough, of course, just a sketch, the kind of preliminary draft my father would have covered with notes and corrections. But the essential concept was there, emerging from my pencil as though it had been waiting all along to be released. I drew the multiple arches, smaller than the original design, arranged in a cascading pattern that would distribute weight more evenly across the span. I added the counterweights, small towers of stone at intervals along the bridge that would provide stability against the fierce winds that swept through the ravine. I indicated where iron reinforcement could be used most effectively, not as the primary support, but as a secondary system to guard against movement in the fractured bedrock, a skeleton of metal hidden within a body of stone. I was so absorbed in my work that I did not hear the door open. I did not hear the footsteps crossing the polished floor, the soft sound of expensive leather on ancient wood. I did not realize I was no longer alone until a voice, cold and sharp as a blade, spoke directly behind me. "What do you think you are doing?" I turned so quickly that I knocked the pencil from the table. It clattered to the floor, impossibly loud in the sudden silence. The Duke stood there, a glass of brandy in his hand, his expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight. He had removed his dinner jacket, and his white shirt was open at the collar, giving him a slightly disheveled appearance that only emphasized the intensity of his gaze. My heart seized in my chest. I opened my mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain, but no words came. My tongue felt thick and useless, my mind blank with terror. This was it. This was the end. I had overstepped in ways that could never be forgiven, never be explained. A housemaid, drawing engineering plans at her master's table, presuming to solve problems that had baffled the finest minds in England. He stepped closer, his gaze moving from my face to the napkin clutched in my trembling hands. I watched as his expression shifted, as confusion replaced displeasure, as something I could not name flickered in his storm-gray eyes. He set down his brandy on the table, the crystal clicking softly against the wood, and held out his hand. "Give that to me." I obeyed. What else could I do? I handed him the napkin and stood there, trembling like a leaf in a winter wind, waiting for the dismissal I was certain would follow. I had overstepped in ways that could never be forgiven. The scandal of it, the presumption. I would be turned out without a reference, left to fend for myself in a world that had no place for disgraced women. But the Duke did not speak. He studied the napkin, his brow furrowed, his lips pressed into that thin line I had come to recognize as concentration rather than anger. His eyes moved over my rough sketch, following the lines of the arches, pausing at the counterweights, tracing the paths of force distribution that I had indicated with hasty arrows. The silence stretched between us, thick and unbearable, until I thought I might shatter from the weight of it. "Where did you learn this?" he asked finally, his voice low. I swallowed, my throat dry. "My father, Your Grace." He was. He had an interest in engineering. He taught me when I was young. The Duke looked up, and for the first time since I had arrived at Thornwood Hall, his eyes truly saw me. Not as a servant, not as a piece of furniture, not as one of the countless anonymous figures who kept his great house running. He saw me as a person with thoughts and knowledge, and perhaps, just perhaps, something valuable to offer. "Your father," he repeated. "And who was your father?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I knew I should lie, should maintain the fiction of Vivian Grey from the north, but something in his gaze made deception feel impossible. "Sir Edmund Ashford," I whispered, "of Ashford Park." The Duke's eyes widened. He knew the name, of course. Everyone knew the name, knew the scandal, knew the disgrace. I watched understanding dawn on his face, followed by something that might have been respect, though I could not be certain. "Sir Edmund Ashford's daughter," he said slowly, "is working as a housemaid in my household." "Yes, Your Grace." "Why?" It was such a simple question, and yet it contained multitudes. I could have given him the simple answer, the obvious answer, but something in that moment compelled honesty. "Because I had no other choice," I said. "Because pride is a luxury I can no longer afford. Because I needed to survive, and this was the only way I knew how to do it without losing what remained of my dignity." The Duke was silent for a long moment, his gaze still fixed on the napkin. Then slowly, he pulled out a chair and gestured for me to sit. I stared at him, certain I had misunderstood. "Sit," he repeated, "and explain this to me." I sat, and I explained. What followed was the strangest hour of my life. The candles flickered around us, casting dancing shadows on the paneled walls, and the great house seemed to hold its breath as I spoke. The Duke listened as I walked him through the mathematics of my design, as I explained the principles of load distribution and the physics of arch construction. I spoke of vectors and forces, of weight transfer and counterbalance, using the napkin to illustrate points that words alone could not convey. He asked questions, sharp and probing questions, that revealed a mind far more educated in such matters than I had expected. He had studied the principles, I realized, had read his brother's textbooks and notes in an attempt to understand the work William had left behind. He knew enough to recognize when my explanations made sense and when they required further justification. He challenged my assumptions. Why multiple arches instead of a single reinforced one? Would the counterweights not add excessive weight to the overall structure? How would the iron reinforcement be anchored in fractured limestone? I answered each question as best I could, sometimes confidently, sometimes hesitatingly, and when I faltered, he waited with surprising patience for me to find my footing again. There were moments when I lost myself in the mathematics, when I forgot that I was a housemaid speaking to a duke, when the pure joy of problem-solving took over, and I became once again the girl who had sat at her father's knee, learning the language of numbers. In those moments, his eyes softened, and I caught glimpses of something like wonder in his expression. By the time the candles had burned to stubs and the fire in the hearth had died to embers, something had shifted between us. I could not name it, could not define it, but I felt it as surely as I felt the cold seeping through the windows, as surely as I felt my own heart beating in my chest. This design, the Duke said at last, holding up the napkin, could work. It was not a question, but I answered anyway. I believe so, Your Grace. Though of course I am not an engineer. I could be wrong. You could be, he agreed. But those men who dined at my table tonight, who claim to be engineers, have offered me nothing but excuses and expenses. You have offered me a solution. He stood, tucking the napkin into the pocket of his coat. I rose as well, uncertain of what would happen next. Go to bed, Miss Ashford, he said. We will speak more of this tomorrow. Miss Ashford. Not Gray, not whatever common name I had given when I applied for the position. He had seen through my disguise in a single evening, and he was using my true name as though it were perfectly natural. Your Grace, I began, but he raised a hand to silence me. Tomorrow, he repeated, and I expect you to be prepared to defend this design against every objection I can devise. He left the room without another word, and I stood there in the darkness, my heart pounding against my ribs like a bird against the bars of a cage. I did not sleep that night. How could I? I lay in my narrow bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our conversation. The Duke knew who I was. He knew my father's shame, my family's disgrace, and yet he had not dismissed me. He had listened. He had asked for more. Hope, that dangerous thing, began to stir in my chest. The next morning I was summoned to the Duke's study. The room was exactly as I had imagined it. Dark wood and leather, shelves lined with books, a massive desk covered in papers and drawings. The Duke sat behind the desk, the napkin spread before him, and he did not look up when I entered. Close the door, he said. I obeyed, my hands trembling slightly. I have been reviewing your design, he continued, still not looking at me. I sent a writer to London at dawn with a copy. I have colleagues there, men whose judgment I trust, who will evaluate the feasibility. I stood in silence, waiting. Finally, he looked up. In the meantime, I want you to create a proper draft. Detailed plans with calculations. Can you do that? Yes, Your Grace, I said, though my voice wavered. But I must ask. Why? Why would you trust the word of a housemaid over the advice of trained engineers? The Duke leaned back in his chair, his gray eyes studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Because my brother trusted unconventional minds, he said quietly. William believed that innovation came from unexpected places, that brilliance was not the exclusive province of men with degrees from Cambridge. He would have loved your design. He would have seen its elegance immediately. His voice caught on the word elegance, and for a moment I glimpsed the grief that lay beneath his cold exterior. This man, I realized, was not unfeeling. He was wounded. He had built walls around his heart so high and thick that no one could breach them. But behind those walls, he was still mourning a loss that had never healed. I will do my best, Your Grace, I said softly. I expect nothing less, Miss Ashford. He paused, then added, You will be given a room in the East Wing. More suitable quarters for the work you will be doing. Lady Beatrice has been informed. Your Grace, I cannot. You can, and you will. His tone brooked no argument. Consider it an adjustment to your position. You are no longer a housemaid. You are a consultant, an advisor on the bridge project. And if the engineers in London deem my design worthless, then we will return to where we began, and you may resume your previous duties if you wish. but I do not believe that will be the outcome." He stood and walked to the window, his back to me, looking out over the grounds toward the ravine where his brother's dream lay half-built and crumbling. "My brother left me his designs," he said. "I have studied them for 3 years, trying to understand what he intended, trying to find a way to make his vision real. I have hired engineers and architects and men who claim to be geniuses, and none of them have come as close to solving the problem as you did in a single evening, on a napkin, with a dinner pencil." He turned to face me, and the intensity in his gaze stole my breath. "I do not pretend to understand how you know what you know, Miss Ashford. I do not pretend to believe that a woman of gentle birth would choose to scrub floors unless circumstances had driven her to desperate measures. But what I do know is that your mind holds something valuable, and I would be a fool to dismiss it simply because it comes in an unexpected form." I did not know how to respond. No one, not even my father, had ever spoken to me with such directness about my abilities. I had spent my entire life hiding my knowledge, downplaying my understanding, pretending to be less than I was because society demanded it. And here was this cold, aristocratic, grieving man telling me that my mind was valuable. "Thank you, Your Grace," I managed. "Do not thank me yet," he replied, a ghost of a smile crossing his lips. "The work ahead will be difficult, and I am not an easy man to please. That, I thought, is something I already knew." But I said nothing, only nodded and allowed myself to be escorted to my new quarters in the East Wing. The room they gave me was modest by the standards of Thornwood Hall, but impossibly luxurious compared to my attic chamber. It had a proper bed with a feather mattress, a writing desk by the window, and a fireplace that actually produced heat. Lady Beatrice had arranged for some of my belongings to be moved, and she had left a note expressing her hopes that I would find the accommodation suitable. I sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the strangeness of my circumstances. Yesterday, I had been a servant. Today, I was something else entirely, something without a name or clear definition. The Duke had called me a consultant, but what did that mean? What would be expected of me? And what would happen when the household learned that the new maid in the East Wing was actually the disgraced daughter of a bankrupt baronet? There was no time to dwell on such questions. Within an hour of my settling in, a footman arrived with a stack of papers, Lord William's original designs for the bridge, along with the reports from the various engineers who had attempted to complete it. The Duke, it seemed, was serious about putting me to work. I spent the rest of that day and most of the night studying the documents. Lord William's designs were beautiful, elegant in their conception, but I could see immediately where they had gone wrong. He had not accounted for the fractured bedrock, likely because he had not known about it when he drew up the plans. The later engineers had identified the problem, but had responded with brute force rather than ingenuity, proposing solutions that were expensive, time-consuming, and unlikely to work. My design, rough as it was, addressed the issue differently. Instead of fighting the geology, it worked with it, distributing load across multiple points and using counterweights to maintain stability. The more I studied the problem, the more confident I became that my approach was sound. But confidence is not proof. I knew that. I knew that my sketches and calculations would need to be verified, tested, challenged by minds sharper than my own. The Duke had said he was sending my design to colleagues in London, and I found myself alternating between hope and terror at the thought of their verdict. Days passed. I worked in my new room, venturing out only for meals, which I took in the servants' hall despite my changed circumstances. The other servants regarded me with suspicion and confusion, uncertain how to treat a woman who had been one of them and was now something else. I did not blame them. I was uncertain how to treat myself. The Duke sent for me twice during that first week. Each time we reviewed my progress, discussed modifications to the design, and debated the finer points of engineering. He was demanding and sometimes harsh, but beneath his criticism, I sensed genuine engagement. He was not dismissing my ideas. He was testing them. and when I defended them successfully, I caught glimpses of approval in his storm-gray eyes. It was during our third meeting that the dynamic between us began to shift. We were arguing about the placement of the counterweights. The Duke believed they should be closer to the main span. I maintained that positioning them farther back would provide greater stability in high winds. We had been going back and forth for nearly an hour, our voices rising, our tempers fraying, when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence and stared at me. "What?" I demanded, flustered by his sudden silence. "You," he said slowly, "are the most stubborn woman I have ever encountered." I felt heat rise to my cheeks. "Is that meant to be a criticism, Your Grace?" "It is meant to be an observation." He leaned back in his chair, a strange expression crossing his face. My brother was stubborn too. He drove me mad with it, but he was usually right, in the end. "And am I?" I asked before I could stop myself. "Right?" The Duke held my gaze for a long moment. Then, astonishingly, he smiled. It was a small thing, barely a curve of his lips, but it transformed his face utterly. The severity softened, the coldness melted. For a single instant, I saw the man beneath the title, the grieving brother who had loved deeply and lost terribly. "We shall see," he said. "The response from London should arrive any day now." I left that meeting with my heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with engineering. The letter from London arrived on a gray afternoon in late November. I was in my room, working on yet another revision of the plans, when a knock at my door announced the Duke's personal footman. "His Grace requests your presence in the study," the footman said. Immediately. I followed him through the corridors, my stomach tight with anxiety. The Duke's response from London. This was it. Everything I had worked for, everything I had risked, would be validated or destroyed in the next few minutes. The Duke was standing by the window when I entered, a letter in his hand. He did not turn to greet me. I waited, barely breathing, as the silence stretched between us. Finally, he spoke. "They are impressed," he said, and his voice held a note of wonder that I had never heard before. Not just impressed, they are astonished. One of them, a man named Professor Hartwell who teaches at King's College, has called your design, and I quote, "one of the most elegant solutions to a structural problem I have encountered in my career." I swayed on my feet. "Your Grace." He turned then, and his eyes met mine. "They want to see more. They want detailed plans, stress calculations, material specifications. And they want to know who created it." He paused, a muscle working in his jaw. "I have not told them. I did not know if you wished your involvement to be known. I had not considered this. I had not thought beyond the hope that my design might work, that I might contribute something meaningful to the project that had consumed the Duke's heart. The question of credit, of recognition, had not entered my mind. "Why does it matter?" I asked. "The design is what matters, not who drew it." The Duke shook his head. "It matters because credit is power, Miss Ashford. In the world of engineering, in the world of academia, a revolutionary design can make a career. Or, in the case of a woman, it can be dismissed as an anomaly, attributed to a man, or simply forgotten." His words were harsh, but I knew they were true. How many women throughout history had created, invented, discovered, only to see their contributions erased or assigned to men? My own father had told me stories of such injustices, his voice bitter with the awareness that his daughter's gifts might never be recognized. "What would you have me do?" I asked quietly. The Duke set down the letter and approached me. He moved with the deliberate grace of a man accustomed to power, but there was something different in his bearing now. A hesitancy, a vulnerability. "I would have you take the credit you deserve," he said. "I would have you stand before the Engineering Society and defend your work. I would have the world know that it was Vivian Ashford who saved my brother's dream." Tears pricked at my eyes. I blinked them back, refusing to weep in front of this man who had shown me more respect than any other. "And if the world refuses to listen?" I asked. If they dismiss me because I am a woman, because I am disgraced, because I do not have the credentials they demand, then they will be fools, the Duke said simply, and I will ensure they know it. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the barriers I had faced all my life could be broken, that my mind could be valued for its own sake. But years of experience had taught me caution. Your Grace, I began, but he raised a hand. Sebastian, he said. My name is Sebastian, and I believe, given the circumstances, that we might dispense with some formalities. I stared at him, speechless. The Duke of Thornwood was asking me to use his Christian name. The impropriety of it should have shocked me, but instead, I felt a strange warmth spreading through my chest. Sebastian, I repeated, testing the name on my tongue. It felt intimate, dangerous. Vivian. He said my name the same way I had said his, with a weight and significance that went beyond mere syllables. He was standing close to me now, close enough that I could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, the faint lines of worry around his mouth. I want you to know that whatever happens with the bridge, whatever the engineers decide, I am grateful for what you have given me. I have given you nothing but a sketch on a napkin. You have given me hope. His voice was barely above a whisper. For 3 years, I have carried my brother's dream like a stone around my neck. I have poured money and effort and sleepless nights into a project that seemed doomed to fail. And then you appeared, a woman who scrubs floors and solves engineering problems with the same hands, and you gave me a reason to believe it might succeed. I did not know what to say. The air between us seemed to thicken, charged with something I could not name but could not ignore. His eyes searched my face, looking for something I was not sure I could give. I did not mean to care for you, he continued, each word seemingly pulled from somewhere deep within him. I have spent years building walls against such feelings. After William died, I swore I would never let myself be vulnerable again. But you, he trailed off, shaking his head. You have undone me, Vivian Ashford, and I do not know what to do about it. My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain he could hear it. I had dreamed of such words, in the secret chambers of my mind, where I allowed myself to imagine impossible things. But hearing them spoken aloud, by this man, in this moment, was overwhelming. You should do nothing, I heard myself say. I am a servant in your household, a disgraced woman with no fortune and no prospects. Whatever you feel, it cannot lead anywhere respectable. Respectability, he said, with a bitter edge to his voice, is a cage built by people who fear what they cannot understand. I have lived my entire life according to its rules, and it has brought me nothing but isolation and grief. He reached out and took my hand. His fingers were warm against my skin, his grip firm but gentle. The touch sent sparks racing up my arm. I am not asking for respectability, he said. I am asking for you. Your mind, your courage, your stubbornness that drives me to distraction. I am asking if there is any possibility, any chance at all, that you might feel the same. The question hung between us, fragile as spun glass. I thought of all the reasons I should say no. The scandal it would cause, the whispers and judgments, the impossibility of a duke marrying a disgraced servant, no matter how noble her birth. But then I thought of the past months, the hours spent working together, arguing over calculations and designs, the way his face softened when he spoke of his brother, the glimpses I had caught of the man behind the title, wounded and lonely, and desperately seeking connection. I thought of my own loneliness, the years of hiding who I was, suppressing my talents, pretending to be less than I knew myself to be. The joy I had felt when he listened to my ideas, took them seriously, treated me as an equal. And I thought of hope, that dangerous, wonderful thing that had taken root in my heart and refused to be uprooted. There is a chance, I whispered. His face transformed. The severity melted away, replaced by something radiant and unguarded. He raised my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my knuckles, a gesture that was both tender and fervent. "Then we will find a way," he said. "Whatever it takes, whatever obstacles arise, we will face them together." I should have known that obstacles would arise sooner than either of us anticipated. The news of my changed position within the household could not be contained forever. Servants talk, and within weeks, rumors had spread not only through Thornwood Hall, but to the neighboring estates, and eventually to London itself. The disgraced daughter of Sir Edmund Ashford was living in the Duke of Thornwood's household. She had been a maid. Now she was something else, something undefined, and speculation ran wild. Lady Beatrice, bless her kind heart, did her best to quell the gossip. She spoke of me as a family friend who had fallen on hard times and was being given assistance by the Duke out of Christian charity. It was a thin explanation, and few believed it, but it provided some cover for my presence in the East Wing. The greater challenge came from the engineering establishment. The Duke, true to his word, had begun introducing my work to his colleagues in London. The response was mixed. Some were intrigued by the design, impressed by its elegance and innovation. Others were outraged that a woman, and a woman without formal training at that, would presume to offer solutions to problems that had stumped educated men. Professor Hartwell, the man who had initially praised my work, became my champion. He was an elderly scholar with white whiskers and twinkling eyes, a man who cared more for ideas than for convention. He invited me to London to present my design to a select group of engineers, promising to vouch for my competence and ensure I was treated with respect. The Duke insisted on accompanying me. He said it was for propriety's sake, that a woman traveling alone would attract unwanted attention. But I knew there was more to it. He wanted to be there when I faced my critics. He wanted to support me, protect me, celebrate with me if things went well. We traveled to London in early December, the countryside brown and bare outside the carriage windows. Lady Beatrice came as my chaperone, her presence lending legitimacy to the arrangement. The Duke sat across from me, his gray eyes thoughtful, his manner solicitous. "Are you nervous?" he asked as we neared the city. "Terrified," I admitted. He reached across and took my hand. "They will see what I see," he said. "Intelligence, innovation, courage. Or they will see a woman overstepping her bounds. Then they will be wrong." His voice was fierce. "And I will make sure they know it." The presentation took place in a lecture hall at King's College, a grand room with tiered seating and a podium at the front. The walls were lined with portraits of distinguished scholars and engineers, men who had shaped the modern world with their inventions and discoveries. Gas lamps cast a steady glow over the proceedings, and the air smelled of pipe tobacco and paper and something that might have been ambition. About 30 men were in attendance, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical to openly hostile. They sat in their seats like judges at a trial, watching me approach the podium with a mixture of anticipation and disdain. I wore my finest dress, a deep blue gown that Lady Beatrice had helped me select, and I had pinned my hair up in a style that I hoped conveyed competence rather than vanity. I stood at the podium, my drawings spread before me on a large table, and for a moment, terror threatened to overwhelm me. My hands shook, my voice caught in my throat. I looked out at that sea of faces, at the crossed arms and raised eyebrows, and I thought, they will never listen. They have already decided I am not worth hearing. Then I thought of my father, who had believed in my abilities when no one else would. I remembered his voice, patient and encouraging, as he guided me through complex calculations by candlelight. I remembered his pride when I solved problems that had stumped him, his joy when I showed an aptitude for the work he loved. I thought of Lord William, whose dream I was trying to save. Though I had never met him, I felt I knew him through his drawings and notes, through the love Sebastian bore for his memory. He had been an innovator, a dreamer, a man who believed that progress was possible if only one had the courage to pursue it. And I thought of Sebastian, seated in the front row, his gray eyes fixed on me with unwavering faith. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and in that small gesture I found the courage I needed. I began to speak. I will not pretend that the presentation went smoothly. There were interruptions almost from the beginning, challenges and objections that came as much from prejudice as from genuine inquiry. One gentleman, a portly fellow with a red face and a condescending manner, asked if I had truly created the design myself or if I was merely presenting work done by a man who wished to remain anonymous. "I assure you, sir," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite my racing heart, "that every line, every calculation, every concept you see before you originated in my own mind. If you doubt that, I invite you to test me. Ask me any question about the design, and I will answer it." He did. He asked about stress calculations and material strengths, about wind loads and foundation requirements. He asked about the angle of the arches and the composition of the mortar. He asked questions that I suspected he did not fully understand himself, questions designed to trip me up rather than to seek genuine answers. I answered everyone. I drew on the knowledge my father had given me, on the endless hours I had spent studying engineering texts and Lord William's notes, on the work I had done over the past weeks refining my design. I spoke with a confidence I had not known I possessed, explaining concepts in clear, precise language that left no room for doubt. Slowly, grudgingly, the skepticism in the room began to give way to something else. Not acceptance exactly, not yet, but acknowledgement. They could not deny that I knew what I was talking about. They could not dismiss me as a fraud or a figurehead. Whatever they thought of women in engineering, they had to concede that this particular woman had mastered the subject. By the end of the presentation, Professor Hartwell was beaming with pride. The portly gentleman had fallen silent, his arms uncrossed, his expression thoughtful rather than hostile. And several of the younger engineers, men who perhaps had not yet fully absorbed the prejudices of their elders, were looking at me with something that might have been admiration. "Well done," Sebastian murmured as I stepped down from the podium. "Well done, indeed." His voice was thick with emotion, and when I looked at him, I saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. The aftermath of the presentation was a whirlwind of discussions, debates, and negotiations that stretched over several days. The Engineering Society, after much deliberation, agreed to endorse my design for the Thornwood Bridge. It was not a unanimous decision. Several members still objected to the idea of a woman's work being credited, and they made their displeasure known in no uncertain terms. But they were outvoted by those who cared more about innovation than tradition, more about results than convention. I returned to Yorkshire with a sense of triumph that I had never expected to feel. The girl who had scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots had stood before the greatest minds in English engineering and held her own. The disgraced daughter of a bankrupt baronet had been acknowledged as a designer of bridges. Work on the bridge began in earnest the following spring, when the frost had finally released its grip on the moorland and the ground was soft enough for excavation. I returned to Thornwood Hall as the project's chief consultant, a title that raised eyebrows throughout the county, but could not be challenged given my proven expertise. The Duke hired a team of engineers to execute the design, men who had been present at my presentation and had come away impressed enough to set aside their reservations. They treated me with respect, if sometimes grudging, and deferred to my judgment on technical matters. I spent my days at the construction site, watching as my design took shape in stone and iron. The first foundation was poured in April, a mixture of limestone, aggregate, and morite that would cure over the summer months. The first arch was raised in July, its stones fitted together with a precision that made my heart swell with pride. Each day brought new progress, new challenges, new moments of triumph and anxiety. The work was grueling and often frustrating. There were setbacks when the limestone proved more fractured than expected, requiring additional reinforcement. There were delays when supplies failed to arrive on schedule, when workers fell ill with fever, when the river flooded after a week of heavy rain. But we pressed on, day after day, month after month, and the bridge grew before our eyes. I discovered a joy in the physical work that I had not anticipated. I learned to read the weather in the clouds, to predict when rain would halt our progress, to know by the feel of the wind whether the mortar would set properly. I learned the names and families of every worker on the site, from the master masons to the youngest laborers. I learned that theory and practice were not always the same, that mathematics could describe the world but could not fully capture its complexity. The months that followed were some of the happiest of my life. I spent my days at the construction site, covered in dust and limestone powder, shouting orders over the din of hammers and saws. I spent my evenings with Sebastian, walking the grounds of Thornwood Hall as the sun set over the moors, discussing everything from philosophy to politics to our hopes for the future. And I spent my nights dreaming of a life I had never dared imagine, a life where I was valued for my mind as much as for my heart. Our relationship necessarily remained private during those months of construction. The scandal of a duke courting a disgraced woman, even one who had proven herself as an engineer, would have been too great to weather openly. The work itself provided cover for our time together, for the hours we spent at the construction site and the evenings we spent reviewing progress in his study. But our feelings grew despite our caution. In stolen moments between consultations, our eyes would meet and linger. When our hands brushed over architectural drawings, neither of us pulled away. And on the rare occasions when we found ourselves truly alone, walking the grounds of Thornwood Hall in the twilight, the air between us grew thick with words unspoken. He told me about William during those walks, about the brother he had lost and never stopped mourning. He spoke of their childhood, of the games they had played in these very gardens, of the dreams they had shared for the future of the estate. He spoke of the guilt that haunted him, the feeling that he should have been there when William died, should have somehow prevented the accident that had stolen him away. "I lost my parents young," he said one evening as we stood at the edge of the ravine, watching the workers pack up their tools for the day. William was all I had. He was my family, my confidant, my dearest friend. When he died, I felt as though half of myself had been torn away. "I understand," I said softly. When my father passed, I felt much the same, as though the world had lost its color, and I was merely going through the motions of living. He looked at me then, his gray eyes soft with understanding. "But you found color again," he said. "You found purpose. This bridge, your work, it has given you something to live for." "As it has given you," I replied. He nodded slowly. "Yes, but more than the bridge." He reached out and took my hand, his fingers warm against my skin. "You have given me something I thought I would never feel again, Vivian. Hope, connection, the possibility of happiness." My heart swelled at his words, but I forced myself to be practical. "Sebastian, we cannot. The scandal would be. I know." His voice was heavy with resignation. "I know what society would say. A duke and a disgraced woman, a nobleman and his former housemaid. It would be fodder for gossip from here to London and back again." He released my hand and turned away, his shoulders tight with frustration. "But I find I care less and less what society says. I have spent my whole life doing what was expected of me, being the duke that my father trained me to be, marrying according to my station had the right woman ever presented herself. And where has it gotten me? Alone in a great house, mourning a brother I could not save." I stepped closer to him, laying my hand on his arm. "You are not alone," I said. "Not anymore." He turned to face me, and in his eyes I saw all the longing and vulnerability that he usually kept so carefully hidden. "No," he agreed. "Not anymore." We agreed to wait until the bridge was complete, until my reputation was established beyond question, until the whispers had died down enough to allow a proper courtship. It was the prudent course, the wise course, and we both knew it. But our hearts, I discovered, cared no more for prudence than love cares for intention. Every day that passed drew us closer together, binding us with threads of shared purpose and mutual respect that would, in time, prove stronger than any scandal. It was Lady Beatrice who first suggested we might not need to wait as long as we feared. "Society has a short memory," she told me one afternoon as we took tea in her sitting room. The fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth, and pale winter light filtered through the frosted windows. "The scandal of your father's bankruptcy is already fading from popular consciousness, and your success with the bridge is beginning to overshadow it. A few more months, a few more triumphs, and people will forget there was ever anything to whisper about." She paused, setting down her teacup with a gentle clink. "I have watched you and Sebastian together," she continued. "I have seen the way he looks at you, the way his whole bearing changes when you enter a room. He has not been this alive, this engaged with the world, since before William died." I felt heat rise to my cheeks. "Lady Beatrice, I am sure I do not know what you mean." She smiled, a knowing smile that reminded me how little escapes the notice of wise women. "My dear, I am old, but I am not blind, and neither, I suspect, is anyone else in this household." I thought of the servants, of the knowing glances exchanged over dinner service, of the way conversations seemed to halt whenever Sebastian and I passed by together. Perhaps we had been less discreet than we imagined. "I do not disapprove," Lady Beatrice added gently. "On the contrary, I have never seen Sebastian so happy, and any woman who can bring light back into those storm-gray eyes has my blessing and my gratitude. But I wanted you to know that you need not wait forever. Life is short, and love is rare. Do not waste either on the opinions of small-minded people." Her words stayed with me long after I returned to my own room. I wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that the barriers I had faced all my life could be overcome. But I knew how cruel society could be, how eager to tear down anyone who dared to rise above their prescribed station. A woman who designed bridges. A woman who fell in love with a duke. The combination was almost too audacious to contemplate. Still, hope persisted, and with each passing day, each completed section of the bridge, each grudging acknowledgement from the engineering world, that hope grew stronger, like a flame that refuses to be extinguished. The spring gave way to summer, and summer to autumn. The bridge rose steadily from its foundations, the multiple arches taking shape exactly as I had envisioned them on that fateful napkin. The counterweights were erected, squat towers of gray stone that stood like sentinels along the span. The iron reinforcement was laid with painstaking precision, a skeleton of metal that would guard against the shifting of the fractured bedrock for centuries to come. And through it all, Sebastian and I grew closer. We argued over technical details and marveled at the beauty of what we were creating together. We shared meals in his study, surrounded by drawings and calculations, discussing everything from the philosophy of bridge design to the nature of love itself. We walked the moors as the heather bloomed purple and the air grew crisp with approaching autumn. I fell in love with him piece by piece, the way one falls asleep, slowly at first, then all at once. I loved his intensity and his passion, his devotion to his brother's memory, and his determination to see the bridge completed. I loved his rare smiles and his dry humor, his intelligence and his willingness to listen to ideas that challenged his own. I loved the way he looked at me, as though I were something precious and rare, something worth protecting. And I knew, though neither of us had spoken the words aloud, that he loved me too. The bridge was completed in late autumn, almost exactly a year after that fateful dinner party where I had drawn on a napkin. The final stone was laid on a crisp October morning when the moors were painted in shades of amber and rust, and the sky above was a brilliant, cloudless blue. I stood at the construction site, watching as the last piece of carved limestone was hoisted into place. The workers had gathered to witness the moment, Men who had labored through rain and heat, through setbacks and triumphs, to bring my design to life. Their faces were weathered by months of outdoor work, their hands rough and capable, but their eyes shone with pride. The Duke stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back. He had been there for nearly every important moment of the construction, watching and learning, asking questions and offering encouragement. This bridge had been his brother's dream, and now it was his monument, and I knew that seeing it completed was both a joy and a sorrow to him. The final stone settled into place with a satisfying sound, mortar oozing from its edges before being smoothed by expert hands. A cheer went up from the assembled workers, caps thrown into the air, men embracing one another with the camaraderie of shared achievement. "It is done," Sebastian said softly, and his voice caught on the words. "William, it is done." I looked at him and saw tears tracking down his cheeks. Unashamed and unwiped, I reached out and took his hand, offering what comfort I could. "He would be proud," I said, "not just of the bridge, but of you, of everything you have done to honor his memory." He squeezed my hand, unable to speak. We stood there in silence as the celebration continued around us, two souls bound together by loss and love and the enduring power of hope. The Duke hosted a grand celebration to mark the occasion a week later, when the mortar had fully set and the bridge was ready to bear the weight of traffic. Invitations had been sent throughout the county and beyond, and the response had been overwhelming. Everyone, it seemed, wanted to witness the completion of the project that had consumed the Duke of Thornwood for so many years. All of the county was invited. Landowners arrived in their finest carriages, their wives and daughters dressed in silks and satins despite the autumn chill. Farmers came in their best Sunday clothes, children in tow, eager to see the marvel that would transform their lives. Merchants and craftsmen, villagers from Thornwick and beyond, everyone who had watched the bridge rise from the ravine gathered to see the finished structure. The bridge itself was decorated for the occasion. Garlands of autumn leaves and late-blooming flowers draped from the counterweight towers. Ribbons of red and gold fluttered in the breeze. And at the center of the span, a crimson ribbon had been stretched from one railing to the other, waiting to be cut. At the center of it all, standing on the bridge itself as the ribbon-cutting ceremony commenced, was Sebastian, Duke of Thornwood. He looked magnificent in his formal coat, his dark hair gleaming in the autumn sunlight, his posture erect and commanding. But there was something different about him today, a lightness in his bearing that I had never seen before. The weight of grief and obligation had lifted from his shoulders, replaced by something that looked very much like peace. He gave a speech. He spoke of his brother William, of the dream that had begun in a young engineer's fertile imagination and had finally come to fruition through the efforts of so many. He spoke of the years of struggle, of the failures and setbacks, of the moments when he had nearly given up hope. He spoke of innovation and perseverance, of the importance of embracing new ideas even when they came from unexpected sources. He spoke of the bridge not just as a structure of stone and iron, but as a symbol of connection, of the bonds that unite us to one another and to the land we call home. And then, to my shock and terror, he spoke of me. This bridge would not exist without the brilliant mind of Miss Vivian Ashford, he declared, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Hundreds of faces turned to look at me, and I felt my cheeks flame with embarrassment and pride. She saw what trained engineers could not see. She solved problems that had baffled the best minds in London, and she did it with grace, courage, and a determination that humbles me. The crowd murmured, whispers passing from person to person like ripples in a pond. Some voices were approving, impressed by the story of the woman who had designed the bridge they now stood upon. Others were scandalized, shocked that a duke would publicly praise a woman of such questionable history. But Sebastian was not finished. Miss Ashford came to this household under difficult circumstances, he continued. She had lost everything, her family, her fortune, her place in society. Many would have given up. Many would have accepted defeat. But she did not. She took a position as a housemaid, determined to survive through honest labor. And in doing so, she showed more courage than I have seen in men who call themselves heroes. I stood at the edge of the crowd, my face burning, my heart racing. I wanted to flee, to hide, to pretend I was invisible again. But Sebastian held out his hand, inviting me to join him on the bridge. The crowd parted before me like the Red Sea before Moses, and I walked forward on trembling legs. I climbed the gentle slope of the bridge, passing between the counterweight towers, until I stood before the man I loved. He took my hand, his fingers warm and steady against my own, and raised it to his lips. The gesture was tender and possessive all at once, a public declaration of something that had been private for so long. "Miss Ashford," he said, loudly enough for all to hear, "I have asked you once before, in private, if there was any chance you might feel for me what I feel for you. Now I ask you again, before all these witnesses, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The gasps from the crowd were audible. The whispers began immediately, shock and scandal rippling through the assembled guests like wind through wheat. I heard fragments of their reaction, disbelief and disapproval, and, from some quarters, something that might have been delight at the audacity of it all. But I barely heard them. I was looking into Sebastian's eyes, seeing the love and hope and vulnerability there, the courage it had taken for this proud man to humble himself before his neighbors and peers. He had laid his heart bare, risking rejection and ridicule, all because he believed that our love was worth fighting for. And in that moment, I knew my answer. I had known it, perhaps, from the first evening we had spent together in the candlelit dining room, debating arches and counterweights while something deeper took root between us. "Yes," I said, my voice stronger than I had expected. "Yes, I will." The crowd erupted. Some cheered, caught up in the romance of the moment. Others muttered their disapproval, scandalized by the match between a duke and a woman of such questionable history. But Sebastian did not seem to hear any of it. He was looking at me, only at me, and the smile that spread across his face was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. He took me in his arms, right there on the bridge that I had designed and he had built in memory of his brother, and he kissed me. It was not a proper kiss, not a chaste pressing of lips that society would have deemed acceptable. It was a kiss of passion and promise, of two souls finding each other against all odds, and I did not care who watched or what they thought. The bridge, I realized in that moment, had always been more than a structure of stone and iron. It was a symbol of connection, of the bonds that join us to one another and to the past. William had dreamed of it as a way to unite his estate, to bring together what nature had divided. But it had become something more than that. It had become the foundation of a love that I had never expected to find. The wedding took place in the chapel at Thornwood Hall on a snowy afternoon in January. The world outside was white and hushed, a blanket of peace covering the moorland, and inside the ancient chapel, candles flickered against the gray stone walls. It was a small affair, attended only by close friends and family. Lady Beatrice sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Professor Hartwell had traveled from London despite his advancing years, determined to witness the union of the woman whose work he had championed. The servants of Thornwood Hall filled the back pews, including Sarah from the kitchen, who wept openly and without shame. I wore a gown of white silk, simple in its elegance, with a train that swept the stone floor of the chapel. My hair was pinned with the pearl earrings that had once belonged to my mother, the only thing I had managed to save from the creditors. Lady Beatrice had offered them to me as a wedding gift, having purchased them secretly when our estate was liquidated, and her kindness had moved me to tears. Sebastian stood at the altar in his finest coat, his dark hair brushed back from his forehead, his gray eyes soft with emotion. He looked at me as though I were the most precious thing in the world, and in his gaze, I saw our entire future unfolding before us. I walked down the aisle alone. I had no father to give me away, no brother or uncle to escort me. But I did not feel alone. I felt the presence of everyone who had loved me, everyone who had believed in me, every soul who had contributed to the improbable journey that had brought me to this moment. The vicar spoke the ancient words of the marriage ceremony, words that had united countless couples across the centuries. We exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other, to stand together through joy and sorrow, prosperity and adversity. And when Sebastian slipped the ring onto my finger, a band of gold set with a single sapphire the color of a winter sky, I felt something shift within me. I was no longer Vivian Ashford, the disgraced daughter of a bankrupt baronet. I was no longer Vivian Gray, the housemaid who scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots. I was the Duchess of Thornwood, wife of the man I loved, designer of bridges and defier of expectations. I remember thinking, as we walked together from the chapel into the snowy morning, that my father would have been proud. He had raised me to value my mind, to believe in my abilities, to refuse to be diminished by a world that did not understand me. He had given me the tools to rebuild my life when everything seemed lost. And against all odds, I had found a man who valued those same things, who loved me not despite my intelligence but because of it. The years that followed were not without challenges. Society never fully accepted me, and there were drawing rooms where I was not welcome, events from which I was quietly excluded. The whispers never entirely ceased, though they grew softer with time, muffled by the weight of my accomplishments and the unquestionable devotion of my husband. The engineering establishment remained divided on the question of women in their field. Some continued to insist that my success was an anomaly, a fluke of circumstance that should not be taken as evidence that other women might possess similar abilities. But my work on the Thornwood Bridge opened doors for others who came after me, women who dared to dream of careers in mathematics and science and design. I received letters from them sometimes. Young women who had heard of my story and wanted to know how I had done it, how I had overcome the obstacles that society placed in my path. I answered every one, offering what encouragement and advice I could, hoping that my example might light the way for others as my father's teaching had lit the way for me. Sebastian and I built a life together that exceeded my wildest imaginings. We had our disagreements, of course, as all married couples do. He was stubborn and sometimes infuriating, quick to anger and slow to admit when he was wrong. I was no better, as opinionated and headstrong as I had ever been. We argued about politics and philosophy, about the management of the estate and the proper temperature for tea. But we also had love. Deep, abiding, transformative love that grew stronger with each passing year. We had partnership and respect, a meeting of minds as well as hearts. We had the shared satisfaction of having built something meaningful together, not just a bridge but a life. We grew old together in the halls of Thornwood, watching the seasons change over the moors, welcoming friends and colleagues, contributing what we could to the world we loved. Sebastian's hair turned gray and then white, and the lines on his face deepened, but his eyes never lost their intensity, their capacity for wonder and love. He passed 5 years ago now, on a quiet evening in late autumn when the leaves had turned to gold and the air carried the first bite of winter. He died in my arms, in the bedroom we had shared for so many years, looking up at me with those storm-gray eyes that had first seen through my disguise to the person I truly was. "I love you," he whispered. "I have loved you from the moment you showed me that napkin. You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me a reason to believe." "And you," I replied, my voice breaking, "gave me a life I never dreamed was possible. You saw me when no one else would. You believed in me when I could not believe in myself." He smiled, that rare and beautiful smile that had always transformed his face, and then he was gone. I am an old woman now, writing these words by the fire in the library at Thornwood Hall. My hands are gnarled with age, My eyes dimmed by time, but my mind remains clear. The bridge still stands, spanning the ravine, connecting two halves of the estate as William had dreamed it would. Its stone arches rise gracefully against the Yorkshire sky, weathered but strong, a testament to what can be achieved when innovation meets determination. Engineers still come to study it, to marvel at its design. They arrive with notebooks and measuring instruments, eager to understand the principles that make it work. I always make time to speak with them, to share what I know, to tell them the story of how it came to be. But what I remember most, when I think back on my life, is not the technical triumph or the professional recognition. It is not the moment when the engineering society endorsed my work, or the day the final stone was laid, or even the afternoon when Sebastian proposed to me on the bridge I had designed. What I remember most is a single evening in a candlelit dining room, when a grieving duke looked at a sketch on a napkin and froze. When he looked up at me, really looked at me for the first time, and saw not a servant or a disgrace, but a person with something valuable to offer. It is the moment everything changed. The moment hope returned to a man who had lost it, and to a woman who had never allowed herself to feel it. Love, I have learned, comes in unexpected forms. It can be found in the mathematics of a bridge, in the determination to complete a brother's dream, in the courage to see beyond convention and circumstance. It can bloom in the unlikeliest places, between people who should never have met, and grow into something strong enough to span any ravine. I never meant to fall in love with a man who looked at me as though I were invisible. But love, I have learned, cares nothing for intention. And for that, I am eternally grateful. The fire crackles in the hearth as I set down my pen. Outside the window, snow is beginning to fall, covering the grounds of Thornwood Hall in a blanket of white. Somewhere in the distance, barely visible through the swirling flakes, the bridge stands as it has stood for decades, a monument to love and loss and the enduring power of hope. I close my eyes and remember. I remember everything, and I know that when my time comes, when I join Sebastian at last in whatever lies beyond this world, I will go with gratitude in my heart and joy in my soul. For I have been loved. I have been seen. I have built something that will endure long after I am gone. And that, in the end, is all that any of us can ask.